Hey everyone, ever look up at a city skyline, see all those cranes and new apartment buildings, and wonder, how do investors know which ones are actually a good deal? Well, it all comes down to the numbers. Today, we're going to decode the essential metrics that every Canadian real estate investor absolutely needs to know. Let's dive in. Right across Canada, from Vancouver to Halifax, our skylines are just packed with cranes. New apartment buildings, new condos, they're all going up to meet this incredible demand. But behind every single one of those projects, it's not just concrete and steel, it's a spreadsheet. It's a critical set of financial numbers that guides every single decision, right from buying the land to getting that bank loan. So, with any deal, you need a starting point, a foundation. And in real estate, that foundation, that single most important number, is a property's core profit. We call it net operating income, or just NOI for short. The best way to think about NOI is to imagine it's the property's annual salary. It's all the money the building makes from rent and other things after it pays for its day-to-day operating costs, things like property taxes, insurance, and maintenance. Now, the key part here is that this is all before it pays personal bills, like its mortgage. This gives us a really clean, pure look at how profitable the asset itself is, no matter how it's financed. Okay, so getting to that number is actually a pretty straightforward path. First, you start with what the building could possibly make if every single unit was rented out 100% of the time. That's your gross potential income. Then you got to be realistic, so you subtract a bit for vacancies and maybe tenants who don't pay. That leaves you with your effective gross income, what you're actually likely to collect. From there, you just subtract all your operating expenses and voila. What's left over is your net operating income. Simple, clean, and super powerful. All right, so you've got your NOI. Now the fun begins. We can start using that number to do some really quick checks to see what an investment's potential really looks like. Let's play this out. Say you're looking at two different apartment buildings. One's in Calgary, the other's in Montreal. They have totally different prices, different numbers of units, different NOIs. How in the world do you figure out which one is giving you a better bang for your buck? This is exactly where our next metric comes into play. This is where the capitalization rate, or cap rate, becomes your best friend. The formula is super simple. You just take the NOI and you divide it by the property's asking price. The result is the percentage return you would get if you walked in and bought that property with a briefcase full of cash. It totally removes financing from the equation, which lets you compare the raw earning power of two completely different properties, apples to apples. But let's be real for a second. Most people aren't buying multi-million-dollar properties with all cash, right? We use loans. And that's where the cash-on-cash return is absolutely vital. This metric tells you the return on the actual money you took out of your own pocket, your down payment. So you take the NOI, subtract your yearly mortgage payments, and then divide that by the total cash you personally put into the deal. So if there's one thing to remember, it's this. The cap rate tells you how good the property is as a standalone asset. But the cash-on-cash return, that tells you how good the deal is for you with your specific loan. A really smart investor looks at both to get the full story. Of course, it's not just about what you think of the deal. You've got to convince the bank to lend you millions of dollars. And trust me, they have their own set of numbers they care about. And for them, it is all about managing their risk. For lenders, it really all starts with how much they're willing to give you. For a building that's already up and running, they use loan-to-value, or LTV. But, and this is a big one for all the new multi-unit construction we're seeing in Canada, they use loan-to-cost, or LTC. This compares the loan amount to the total project cost, which includes buying the land, construction, everything. It's a really key metric for developers. But if you want to know the lender's absolute favorite, number one metric, it's the debt service coverage ratio, or DSCR. It answers one simple but absolutely critical question. Can this property actually afford to pay its mortgage? You calculate it by taking our old friend, the NOI, and dividing it by the total mortgage payments for the year. Lenders will almost always demand a DSCR of at least 1.25. So what does that actually mean? Well, it means that for every $1 the property owes in mortgage payments for the year, it's generating $1.25 in income. That extra 25 cents, that's the lender's safety cushion. If your DSCR is too low, you're just not getting that loan. Simple as that. Okay, so most of the metrics we've talked about so far are really just a snapshot of year one. But real estate, well, that's a long-term game. It's a marathon, not a sprint. So let's look at the metrics that capture that entire investment journey.
I love this quote because it just perfectly sets up the two powerhouse metrics for long-term analysis. They answer two different but equally important questions. How fast do I get my money back? And how much money do I get back in total?
Just take a look at a typical investment journey. You've got this one big chunk of cash going out the door right at the start. Then you have a few years of smaller, positive cash flows coming in. And then at the end, you get this huge cash inflow when you sell the property. Metrics like cap rate just don't capture this whole story. We need something more powerful. And that's where the internal rate of return, or IRR, comes in. Now look, it's a complicated calculation. We usually leave it to a spreadsheet, thank goodness. But the concept is so important. It gives you a single percentage that represents the total annualized return over the entire life of the investment. And it even accounts for the fact that $1 today is worth more than $1 tomorrow. Basically, a higher IRR means you're getting your profits back faster. And for the how much question, we have the beautifully simple equity multiple. You just add up every single dollar you ever got from the investment, from rent, from the final sale, everything, and you divide it by the cash you put in at the start. So if you get a 2.0x equity multiple, it literally means you doubled your money. It's the simplest way to answer, for every dollar I put in, how many did I get back? So there we have it. We've built our toolkit of key metrics. But, the real art of investment analysis isn't just knowing the formulas. It's using them all together to tell a complete and convincing story about a property's future. See, no single number is king. You could have a deal with a fantastic cash-on-cash return, but a dangerously low DSCR that no bank will ever touch. Or you could have another deal with a kinda meh cap rate, but it has huge potential for rent growth that leads to an amazing IRR down the road. A truly savvy investor looks at all of them to build this 360-degree view of both the opportunity and the risk. So as we look out at our growing cities, we know the investment landscape is always changing. Yeah, construction costs are high, but the demand for housing, especially in Canada's big urban centers, is even higher. And that really leaves us with one final question for you to think about. In today's market, with its high costs and even higher demand, which one of these numbers tells the most important story for you? Are you a developer focused on loan to cost, an income investor chasing that cash-on-cash return, or maybe a long-term player targeting a specific equity multiple? Your answer? Well, that reveals your entire investment strategy. Thanks for joining me for this explainer.